Seb, I was looking for the nice fade out. Hello, welcome everyone. We're looking forward to Ken's talk tonight on the power of the parables of Jesus. And as an introduction to that, we'll read Matthew 13 in a moment. If you just remain where you are, we'll ask God's blessing on tonight. Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. We're grateful for your love and your care and the opportunity to read a book which is centuries old, but it sits on our laps or on our phones. It tells us about you and the great plans you have for us and the world. In the beginning, everything was dark, and you gave us light. Your Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, is the world's brightest light. He lives, he breathes, and soon he will be the King of the world. We seek you through him. Amen. Now, normally what I'd do is I'd read around a bit, but I reckon because it's a bit tricky with the microphone. Hello, everyone at home. My name's James. We'll read Matthew chapter 13. There's going to be two sections, so you're going to have to be alert, Bert. The first section will be verse 1 to 9 and then verse 18 to 23 or thereabouts. On that day, after Jesus went out to the house, he sat by the lake. And such a large crowd gathered around him that he got into a boat to sit while the whole crowd stood on the shore. He told them many things in parables, saying, "Listen. A sower went out to sow. And as he sowed, some seeds fell along the path. The birds came and devoured them. Other seeds fell on rocky ground where they did not have much soil. They sprang up quickly because the soil was not deep. But when the sun came up, they were scorched, and because they did not have sufficient root, they withered. Other seeds fell among the thorns, and they grew up and choked them. But other seeds fell on good soil and produced grain, some 100 times as much, some 60 and some 30. The one who has ears had better listen." Now down to verse 18. "So listen to the parable of the sower. When anyone hears the word about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches what was sown in his heart. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed sown on rocky ground is the person who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. But he has no root in himself and does not endure. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, immediately he falls away. The seed sown among thorns is the person who hears the word, but worldly cares and the seductiveness of wealth choke the word, so it produces nothing. But as for the seed sown on good soil, this is the person who hears the word and understands. He bears fruit, yielding 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown." So with that as an introduction, we look forward to Kent's words tonight, the parables of Jesus.
Thank you very much, James, and evening, everyone. Slight change with what the program had indicated, and obviously that's been brought about due to Kieran having COVID. So what we're actually going to do tonight is we're going to look at the first of a series of two where we look at the parables. And of course, with that little section that James read, if you just look at your Bible and have a look at verse 3, I think there's a powerful lesson that does emerge. And that is, it says, Jesus told them many things in parables. And then, of course, he goes on to elaborate the particular parable that we looked at tonight. Now, due to time constraints, we didn't read all of Matthew 13, But if you actually go down to verse 34, we actually find an affirmation or a reiteration of what Jesus is opening up by saying about the importance of parables. And so if you look at verse 34 of chapter 13, it says, "All these things Jesus said to the crowds in parables. Indeed, he said nothing to them without a parable." And I think in a sense, this provides a very good context for us to be actually considering the parables. What's it actually saying to us? Well, it's opening up by saying the importance of parables, but what we read in verse 34 is there's this attestation by Jesus that says, well, everything that he spoke to individuals, there were parables that were surrounding the words that he spoke. So I think this really just elevates, we might say, when we start to look at the teachings of Jesus, that the parables are very, very important in that context of what Jesus was speaking about. So I think there's three things really that we'd like to look at tonight. The first is, obviously, what is a parable? What do we mean by a parable? What's so important about a parable? And the word sort of featured in our reading that we had. And of course, we've just said that Jesus said that he spoke to people in parables, and without a parable, he didn't speak to individuals. So what does it actually mean when we speak about this term, a parable? We've also picked the parable of the sower, and you're probably saying, why did you pick this particular parable? The reality is that Jesus spoke around about 40 parables. What's interesting, though, is that Matthew, Mark and Luke all record the parables. John doesn't record any of Jesus' parables. And some of you are probably sort of saying, why is it that John, so 4 gospel writers, 3 say, hey, we are going to latch onto the parables, they're very important. But one writer says, no, I'm just not going to do anything about it. And of course, the simple answer there is that John speaks in terms of signs. So Jesus' words, John sort of says, hey, there's a different element towards Jesus' teaching that I want to focus on. I guess a very, very crude, rough analogy would be at different points in time we might watch the news. And what might appear to be on Channel 7 news won't necessarily be on the ABC and conversely. So what we're actually presented, we have 4 gospel writers. 3 of them start to say, hey, there's something special about these particular parables, these particular sayings of Jesus. And Jesus speaks about everyday events. And indeed, this is one of those everyday events. You know, it's a sower. You know, they didn't have agricultural equipment back in Jesus' time. They didn't have sort of, you know, these huge tractors where they were sort of planting in a mechanised way. And it was just simply people were broadcasting seed. And Jesus sort of took that everyday analogy and said, you know what? There's some lessons. There's some lessons that I want to extract. There's something of importance. When you see this everyday type of an event, you know what? I want you to think about not just the sower, but I'm going to use an analogy. I'm going to actually speak in a way using a metaphor to explain that this can be used or seen as a type. Okay, so what? I guess you're probably saying, does this really matter? What's the relevance in 2022? And indeed, do people still use parables today? I think that's a fairly good question. Or is this sort of old school teaching? Jesus decided, hey, in his day, everybody spoke in parables. Well, we're going to see as we go through that no, it's not. And indeed, that very much the use of parables is something that finds its way into contemporary teaching. So first and foremost, let's just define our terms. What do we actually mean when we speak about a parable? Now, I've just picked 3 definitions. These were straight from Uncle Google, so they're just secular sources that have actually defined what a parable is. And I put down the 3 definitions because when we start to expand on these definitions, I think all 3 definitions provide us with some really good, useful insights into what is a parable? And so the first of those definitions, it speaks in terms of it's an illustrative story. So obviously it's designed to illustrate. That good old adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So very much the whole idea of a parable is to give you some sort of visualisation. And of course, based on that visualisation, you're then able to sort of remember what's occurring. Importantly also, you'll see that it's putting something that's familiar and providing some linkages with something that you might not necessarily have joined and seen as being something that was linked. And of course, what's designed to do is it's for comparative purposes. So there's some comparisons between this and that. It's an analogy, it's a metaphor. That's really what that first definition is saying. But it is also about improving understanding. So by looking at the parable, somebody is able to sort of say, hey, I can understand that concept a little easier. The story, in a sense, provides the ability for one to remember, but also to sort of broaden out what might be a challenging concept. The second point says it's rather succinct. So in a sense, the parable that we looked at tonight, and we'll explore that, you'll see that what Jesus is able to do just with one simple little parable, he's able to say, you know what's represented here is, in a sense, a lot of people who are going to come into contact with the gospel message. This is going to be their response. And so in a very, very broad sense, he says that when you think about seed going out, this is really about the gospel message. And again, if you're looking down, verse 19 of chapter 13 affirms for us that Jesus is speaking about the gospel message that is being broadcast. Again, that second point up there also mentions the fact it's talking about lessons or principles. So again, that's the whole idea of our parable. And again, the final one, I included that more because what it actually said was that even though we might use the term parable in a secular sense, just in a normal everyday environment, very much one could actually sort of focus a little bit more and say, well, perhaps the concept of a parable, there is perhaps some sort of spiritual overtones. There's something that's taken not just from the everyday, but it's got its derivative from somewhere else. So that's really where the third of those points actually comes out. So what makes parables powerful? Why are parables so powerful in their teaching mechanisms? I think the immediate issue that does emerge is that whenever we look at the parables, we always have to respond. Jesus is always looking for a particular response. That's really what the parables are designed to do. And many of us can sort of think of other parables beyond what we're just looking at tonight. Think about the parable of the lost in Luke 15. So you've got a lost coin, you've got lost sheep, and you've got a lost son. And the concepts that start to come out from there. The response is, of course, what do you do when something is lost? And of course, that's the immediate action that Jesus is saying. It's designed to be remembered. Think about the parable of the Good Samaritan. I think most of us understand the parable and would know just the general broad mechanics of that particular parable, what it's all about. And immediately we get this context and we can draw to mind what that particular parable is all about. And then, of course, there are some parables, as the third point says, that are designed to inform and to impact the hearer. Think about the parables from Matthew 25, where it speaks about the wise and the foolish. Again, we've got this presented before us. There's a choice. There's this bifurcation. Are we going to be wise? Are we going to be foolish? And of course, there's the parable to do with the pounds. Somebody's given sort of £5, somebody's given 2, somebody's given 1. What are the responses going to be? And so just in a broad sense, you start to see how that we're able to sort of, in a sense, break down where the parables are heading and what they're trying to achieve. So it is all about a response that is required. Now, as I've already alluded, if we look at Matthew 13 and at verse 34, this whole notion is that Jesus spoke to the disciples and he spoke to the crowds and he spoke in parables. Now, what was the key message? So we read that he spoke and without a parable he didn't speak. What's the key message? We did sort of read, there's a couple of instances, but maybe just sort of glance down at Matthew 13. What do you think is the key thought that Jesus is speaking about as you sort of look at Matthew 13? There's sort of, and indeed Matthew 13 is a chapter where there are a significant number of parables, but there's a real little nub about all of those parables. And indeed, by extension, we can say that the focus of all of the parables of Jesus, that it comes down to one particular aspect. Is there any sort of turn of phrase that if you look through Matthew 13, you might sort of say, hey, this sort of percolates to the top? The kingdom of heaven, that's exactly right. Thanks, Tanya. It's all about the kingdom of heaven. And we could shorten that, just the kingdom. Parables are all focused on the kingdom. And here's the challenge. The challenge that I'll put out there is find a parable that doesn't really have as its end game a focus on the kingdom. I think you'll find that all 40 parables that Jesus spoke about, really it's either speaking about the kingdom or it's certainly speaking about kingdom values that he would like his disciples to embrace. So the focus is all about the kingdom. So in a sense, what we're being told here in Matthew 13 is that Jesus, in preaching the gospel, Jesus in sharing the message of the kingdom, how does he do it? What's the mechanism that he uses? The mechanism that he uses is parables. So again, I think that just provides us with further affirmation as to the importance of parables. Now, the issue of parables as to whether they are old school or whether there's some sort of modern twist, I think can be answered, and I've just given a sample of some books. Now, you're probably saying, I'm sure some of you will have heard of Who Moved My Cheese? And on the back of Who Moved My Cheese, it actually says it's a parable. You know, these are all acknowledged by individuals that these particular books, this genre that we've got here, these are all parables. They're telling us a story, and from that we have to take some lessons. So why do I just mention those? And I'm just mentioning those in passing just to reaffirm this particular point, and that is that parables very much are contemporary teaching. And often these days, people, if you go to talks or conferences, people will say, hey, I want to share a story. And so off they go, they share a story or tell something, and then they want to extract some lessons from that. That's really what a parable is, where people are telling a story, then they want to say, hey, you know what? There's sort of a hidden meaning. There's something that I want to share from that particular story. So again, this is something that is not just relegated to 2,000 years ago, but very much we find that this is topical today. So, the parable of the sower that we actually had to look at. And I got James just to read for us the two sections. We could have read really all of Matthew 13 because, as I've indicated, and if you look down at your Bible, you'll see that this is just a series of parables that Jesus actually speaks about. And arguably, Matthew 13, this is a chapter on parables. So, how many parables are there in Matthew 13? So, just looking down, how many parables does Jesus speak here in Matthew 13? So, it's a chapter that's filled with parables. The one that we've looked at is the largest, but towards the end of the chapter, there's a couple of 2-verse parables, multiples of those. Got an 8. Any other? Joe? 6 maybe. 6 maybe, or 6? 6. So we're going from 8 to 6. Catherine?
No.
Oh, you're not.
I'm not counting.
Oh, you're not counting. Okay, you had that look that indicated maybe, but no, that's okay. So what are we going with? Got 8 or 6? Oh, you're going lower.
I'm saying 5.
You're saying 5?
I've got 5, but I could be wrong.
There's 3 kingdoms. I'm going for 7. I'm going
Well, there you go. Any other options? We've sort of got 8, 6, 5, 7. No, I don't think 25. I'll rule that out straight away as being something there.
I'll go 5 actually.
You'll go 5. Do we have any others for 5?
6 maybe.
6 maybe. There's nothing like hedging your bets there, Joe. Well done. I'm going to go for 5 as being what I thought it was, but I have heard others have sort of some larger numbers, but I'm comfortable with 5 as being the definitive answer on that particular case. So, this is a chapter, lots of parables. What makes this particular parable so special? What makes the parable of the sower so special? This is really the key question. And we can't find the answer so much here in Matthew chapter 13, but the parallel record in Mark chapter 4. Now, you don't have to look at that, but in Mark 4, we've got the parallel record. And in Mark 4, we have the words, do you not understand this parable? How then will you understand all the parables? And the context that Jesus is saying, and I think we start to get the gist of that, because what does Jesus actually do? Jesus actually unpacks the parable and says, well, I'm going to show you how you go about interpreting the parable. So this is why this particular parable is so important, because the disciples came to Jesus and were sort of scratching their heads and saying, don't quite understand what's going on. We don't sort of understand this parable, and that's when Jesus, in a sense, says, okay, here's what I'm actually going to do. I'm actually going to explain it. So looking at what Mark has said, I think what we've really got is that this particular parable is perhaps elevated above all of the other parables. Jesus himself is the one who does elevate this parable. And he says that, look, there's going to be a whole lot of other parables, but in a sense, this is a fairly simple one. But the process about interpretation with this is something you could apply to other parables. And again, what's the key with the parables? The key with the parables is that we're either talking about the kingdom of heaven or kingdom values. That's what all of Jesus' parables are speaking about. So the actual parable itself. Let's just have a look at the parable. And again, I'm sure most of you will have come across this particular parable before. You'll be familiar with the fact that there are 4 types of soils that are mentioned. And again, if you go back to Matthew 13, verse 4 tells us about there was a pathway. And then verse 5 tells us some fell on rocky ground. Then, of course, verse 7 speaks about it falling, the seed, that is, fell into an area where there were thorns and there were thistles. And then, of course, we're told in verse 8, some of that seed fell on good soil. So in a sense, we've got quite clear what's being spoken, that the actual seed itself finds its way into 4 different types of soil. So what does this actually mean? And I guess the key question I would say is, would we have immediately been able to understand what Jesus said? So you think for a moment, if Jesus hadn't then explained, would we have immediately come to that conclusion? And I've got to say, I think hand on heart, we have to be honest and say, maybe not immediately. So we can be thankful that the disciples actually said, Lord, we don't understand this particular parable. And so therefore Jesus saw fit to actually expound that particular parable. Now, what was interesting, and James, were you reading the net version of the Bible? So in the net, so if you've got Matthew 13 and at verse 9, it says, he who has ears, let him hear. But I think James's version was sort of a little bit more emphatic with what it was. And what I've actually done is I've gone back to Mark just for the parallel, because it's not so much about hearing. You know, for most of us, we can hear a lot of things. You know, you can hear what I'm saying. We hear lots of messages all the time. But the next step is most important. It's not just about hearing. It's about what's your response. Do you understand the message? And that's really what Mark actually says that Jesus' words are, that anyone with ears to hear, you should listen. So listen to what I've got to say, but more importantly, you've got to understand. So it's not just hey, what a great story that is. What a great story. You've seen this. It's a farmyard story. Jesus is actually saying, okay, hear that, but, and it's a big but, what's that going to do to you? How is this going to change your particular life? And that's really the question, I think, for all of us when we start to look at the parables that Jesus spoke. It's not just about, hey, isn't this a great story? The parables were designed so that, yes, we could hear them. There was an ease with which we could remember them. But importantly, it had to impact our hearts. That's why Jesus spoke the parables, so that it would impact the hearts of individuals. Again, if we can just think for a moment, I'll just say the Good Samaritan. If I say the Good Samaritan, I think most of us immediately, you've only got to say that particular parable. What's the message? What's the message of that parable, the Good Samaritan? What's the message, do you think? It's more than a donkey on a road. What's the actual, if you had to sort of boil it down, what's the message, the Good Samaritan? Number of answers, potential answers here. What's that, do you think? What's that parable about?
Love your neighbour as yourself.
I reckon that's a pretty good answer. Love your neighbour. And who is my neighbour? And that's really what it is. The despised Samaritan, the Good Samaritan, somebody who was despised, stopped, helped, showed mercy. All of those things, they're the sorts of messages that immediately when we say that, and I'm sure most of you had some sort of idea at the back of your minds as to what that Good Samaritan was. And some people don't, I know, like speaking up. But this is the reason why Jesus has got these parables, is so that when we sort of hear just the banner of the parable, so to speak, it should be a case that should just sort of immediately just resonate, and we start to think, that's a parable, this is a story that deals with whatever. So remember what we said with regards to the parables. The whole idea of the parable was that it's an easy to convey message. It's a message that's able to be remembered by individuals. And that's why Jesus is just saying here at this point, hey, hear the message, but most importantly, you need to understand the actual message. So what is the parable all about? So the parable that we've got here of the sower, what is this parable all about? Well, thankfully, Jesus actually unpacks it for us. So if we come down to verse 18, and hence this is why I said we'd read just the 2 sections, What we actually have is that Jesus actually says, well, I'm going to share with you what this particular parable is all about. And so he opens up in verse 18 of Matthew 13, hear then the parable of the sower. Okay, verse 19, when anyone hears the word of the kingdom. And then, of course, at the end of verse 19, it speaks about what has been sown. So I think what we're able to do is immediately we're able to say, what's the seed? What's the seed that is being spoken of when we want to actually dissect the actual parable itself? Well, the seed is basically, we'd say, the word of the kingdom. You could probably substitute the word gospel. I think that's pretty fair to use that. The reason I've used the word of the kingdom is because that's exactly what Matthew is actually saying here. But it's another word, it's the gospel message. That's what the seed is. The seed that's broadcast, it's the gospel message. So it's somebody that's gone out and they're spreading the gospel message. That's the analogy that Jesus is portraying for us. What about that is sown on, and I've said the footpath. I think the version I've got here, ESV, says path, but it's the same as the footpath. If you think about a footpath, what's a footpath? It's pretty downtrodden, isn't it? It's compacted earth. Can seeds generally sort of grow into that area? Probably not as easy. It's hard for a seed to germinate, particularly if the soil's been really, really compacted. And we know that ourselves. If you wanted to sort of grow a garden in your backyard, you're not going to stamp on the ground and try and compact it as much as possible and then say, oh, look, I'll put some seeds in it. What are you actually going to do? You're going to want to sort of make certain that there's sort of a level of aeration with the soil. So again, this is something that we know ourselves, that something that's compacted, then what's going to happen there? Well, what we're going to see there is that it's just going to sit on the top. It can't find its way down into the soil. It just sits on the surface. What's going to happen to seed that sits on the surface? Well, birds are going to sort of have a free lunch. Simple as that. So seed that doesn't penetrate into the earth is, of course, something where there's a degree of hardness that has come into play. And, of course, the seed sown on rocky ground. Now, on rocky ground, what do we actually find? Well, we find there's a mixture, don't we? Obviously, it's got rocks in it. So there's going to be pockets of soil, but there's going to be rocks. Is there going to be the depth of earth? Are you actually going to get that depth? And the answer is, of course, you're not. And if you think about what farmers do, what's one of the things that farmers want to do? They want to get rid of all of the rocks out of their paddocks. They want to get rid of all of the underlying stumps that might be there. They actually want to have really, really good depth of earth. Why? So that the seeds, of course, will go down and then, of course, they will germinate. So what's the situation that we have with the rocky ground? And again, all I've done there, if you look at verse 20, for the third point there, I've just extracted exactly what Jesus says, that sown on rocky ground. And what's this actually saying? Well, as Jesus says, well, this is a situation where there will be some level of germination. But as Jesus describes it, whenever there is problems, he describes it as tribulation or persecution, but the broader issue is problems. What happens? Well, it wilts. Why? Because there is no depth whatsoever of the soil. So in other words, the seed itself can't really get down. The root structure can't form. And so consequently, it shoots up very quickly, scorched by the sun, dies because there is no depth that is attached to it. What about that sown amongst thorns? So that's verse 22. Well, here we're actually painted with a picture by Jesus of people hear the word and things are fine until until the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches, and what ends up happening? They choke out. So again, think about the farming analogy that's there. And Jesus went on to speak about another one when he spoke about the parable of the weeds. What do farmers have to do today? Even in the 21st century, you've got to spray for weeds, yeah? You've got to get rid of anything else that might be in competition for the nutrients in the soil. So that's just one of the principles that farmers look at today. And of course, here we've got a situation where there's sort of, germination of plants, but there's also competition with thorns. And what Jesus actually says is, well, guess what? It's the thorns that win out. And he actually says, and we'll drill down on this one very, very shortly, he says that it's the deceitfulness of riches that causes the real issue. And then finally, the fourth of the soils, it was sown on good soil. And of course, what we actually find here is that there is a manifold increase. So even a 30-fold increase, or 30 times. Jesus isn't saying, hey, everybody's got to be at 100. He says there's 100-fold, there's 60, and there is 30. What's he actually saying? Well, on that good soil, there is an increase. There is an increase that is given. So that's the actual parable. And you might say, well, hey, is that the end of the story? Is that all Jesus really wanted us to do, is to sort of say, okay, there's four sorts of soils representing, of course, four different responses to the gospel message, and end of story. I want to pose a question for you, which I'm sure Jesus would have wanted those who heard this parable for the first time to think about. And that is, what's the similarity between soil 3 and 4? So in soil 3, that's verse 22, that which was sown amongst thorns. And then, of course, soil 4 is the good soil. So what do you think the similarity is between soil 3 and 4? So largely, this is what Jesus is saying. There's 4 different soil types. What's the similarity? There's a similarity between 3 and 4. What would you think that similarity is?
The ability to grow.
It is the ability to grow, and it's almost the word I had, but you've picked up the essence. It's the potential, isn't it? So there's the potential. Both soils had the potential. Yeah, so the ability was there. So that's really what Jesus is wanting us, I think, to say. When you look at it, it's quite clear for the compacted soil, nothing's ever going to grow there. That on rocky ground, people aren't going to expect something there. But when you get down to soils 3 and 4, hey, that's when you start to say, what's the difference? What's the difference? And that's where our next question is. We've looked at the similarity. What's the difference? So the similarity is both have got potential. What's the difference between soils 3 and 4?
I'm just reading from the NIV, and it says for 3 that the word's heard, but for 4 it's heard and understood.
Now that's interesting, Joe, to pick up, because we tried to sort of make mention of that point earlier, because that's a really powerful point that Jesus is wanting to convey in this particular parable. So, in a sense, yes.
One acted on, I guess.
Okay. So now we're getting that. You're correct. One has acted, so there's been a response. Now, to put it into soil terms and agricultural terminology, what's the difference between the good soil and that sown amongst thorns? What's the difference?
Well, the nutrients end up going into the thorns. So the potential is
You're losing the potential, aren't you? Yep. So the real issue is weed control. Would you not agree that weed control is the issue? Right, you've got to get rid of the weeds, and even today, that's what farmers have to do. You know, they plant their crop, but we spent the last week in the Riverland, and in the Riverland you get plenty of ads for everything agriculture. And of course, I don't know how many times I saw all of these sort of knockdown sort of herbicides, weedicides, does everything, doesn't destroy the plants type approach. Weed control is most important. Now, when you think about it, does that sort of make sense? Does that fit the context of what Jesus is saying? Jesus is actually saying, hey, there's a deceitfulness of riches. They choke the word, right? So what do you have to do then? What do you have to do if there's thorns? If they're choking out the word is, of course, that's the good response that Jesus is wanting. What we actually have to do is we have to do some weed control. And that's really what Jesus is wanting us to think about. Now, of course, soils can change over time, can't they? So just because we've had a good lot of soil, it doesn't always mean that it's going to always be good. One year we might not have had anything to do with thorns and weeds and everything else. And then, of course, in another year, that might be problematic. So what do we also need to do when it comes to soils? Now, we won't explore this too much, but obviously, what do soils need? Soils need nutrients. So again, they need to have something added to the actual soil itself that starts to help with the growth of the actual plants themselves or the crop. What's another important element when we want to have good growth? What's vital? So we've got to have good soil. What else is important?
Water and sunshine.
Water and sunshine. Water at the appropriate time and in the right quantity. Water is one of those things that's interesting, that people often say, hey, I need water. But if you speak to farmers, farmers always talk about rain or water at the right time. So there's got to be that optimal arrangement when it comes to water. Now, we won't turn it up, but I'm sure some of you will have immediately said, what does water in the Bible, what does it represent? Water represents the word of God as well. Ephesians 5 and at verse 26 tells us that. What I do want to focus, though, on is this issue of deceitfulness of riches. So if you look at verse 22, I've got the ESV. I'm sure your version will have something similar. It says the deceitfulness of riches. Now, I think that's perhaps worth just exploring just for a moment. If something's deceitful, what does the word deceitful imply? Or what's deceit? Dishonesty is a good way. Dishonesty, yeah, I like that. If something's deceitful, it's dishonest. Maybe it's fraudulent. I also think too that what Jesus also, that there's a degree of cunningness that comes with deceit. But
there's implied misrepresentation.
Misrepresentation.
Making yourself out to be something that
Yep.
it's not.
So instead of it being Jesus saying it's about the cares of the world and of its riches, he says the deceitfulness of riches. You see, one of the things is that the world and indeed the riches, it overpromises and underdelivers. That's really, in essence, what Jesus is trying to get at here. That it doesn't matter how much we have as far as wealth. Are people ever satisfied with the wealth that they've got? The answer is no, they're not. And it doesn't matter if you've got $50 million, people will want $75 million. And if you're a sports person and somebody signed on a contract worth $100 million, if we're talking basketball or baseball, you'd think $100 million, Matt, that'd set you and me up for life, I reckon. We'd be comfortable with that. But I tell you what, over there, people start to complain because $100 million isn't as good because somebody else got $125 million or $150 million or or whatever it happens to be. And you've now got sports people these days who have got $1 billion at their disposal. So Shaquille O'Neal, now some of you will have heard of him, basketball player, ex-basketball player, a billionaire. And there are a number of sports. Are they content with just having $1 billion? I haven't met any billionaires. I've met some millionaires before. And what I can say is that the millionaires that I've met, maybe it's not a cross-section, but I reckon it's pretty close. They are never content with just having $1 million or a couple of $1 million. People always want more. I can't think of the exact quote, but in the Proverbs it speaks about the eye never ever being satisfied along those particular lines. That's the challenge, and that's really starting to get to the real nub of what this particular parable and the importance of this particular parable is for all of us. Really, as we've said, this is a parable that deals with the kingdom. Seeing we're in Matthew 13, we might just go down to look at Matthew 13 verses 44 and 45. And then just see there. So here we've got just a one-verse parable. Jesus says, "The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field." So in other words, he says, look, it's a situation where they've got other property, right? But guess what they do? They dispose of all the other property because they've found this field that has got treasure. And so everything else, do you think that there may have been treasure with what they had elsewhere? Perhaps. And this is why in the very next parable, Jesus actually reinforces this message. He says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls, who on finding one pearl of great value went and sold all that he had and bought it. Now, what was that merchant person? He had many. He was in search of fine pearls. So he had probably a lot of fine pearls. So there was a lot of wealth. He had a lot of things where you could sort of say, hey, there's some substance there. But then what does he find? What he actually then finds, he says, the pearl of great value. And so all of the wealth that he's got with his other pearls, he says, hey, I'm going to trade all of that in because this pearl of great value, this is worth everything to me. And that's really what the message that Jesus is trying to convey in the parables in Matthew 13 is all about. Now, we haven't looked at all of those particular parables, but the golden thread with them is it's all about the kingdom of heaven. And of course, it comes down to decisions. Individuals need to make decisions. What are you going to do with your particular life? It's your choice. And looking at the parable of the soils tonight, we've all heard, those of us here, that gospel message. That gospel message can start to sort of come into our hearts and to penetrate, or we could be faced with this situation that there is the deceitfulness of riches that starts to choke out. And so even when we're young, we start to make decisions. We start to make decisions as to what's more important to us. And that's really, in a sense, what Jesus is wanting us to do. What's the most important thing? Is it a case that we want to eradicate the weeds from our life? Is it a case that we're somebody who might say, look, I'm going to get rid of, like that merchant person that we've just looked at and says, I've got this pearl of great price. Everything else is worthless. So that's, I guess, the challenge. That's the decision that all of us need to make. What are we actually going to do? And of course, Jesus actually also said at one other point in the New Testament, he said, people have to make a choice. He said, there's a broad way. There's a large broad way. Many people find that way. It's pretty easy. It's signposted, Broadway. You can just follow the crowd. No problems there. It's easy to see, right? That's a pathway, he says, that leads to destruction. Then he also says, well, look, there's this other more obscure route. It's a straight, so it's got some strictures there. little bit more challenging to find. There's few people that are going to find that. But the difference is life and death. And that's what Jesus said. So the choice for all of us is that we need to make those decisions. I thought I might just share this quote from Bob Lloyd. Now, I'm sure everybody, if you're younger, you might not have heard of Bob Lloyd, but you can ask Mum and Dad. Bob Lloyd wrote a very, very good book called Minute Meditations. And in fact, I reckon if you're around about 15 years of age and older, you'd probably be able to read Minute Meditations. Its name, Minute Meditations, is you can read them in a minute. Yeah, absolutely. It's designed for the 21st century. But think about what Bob has said here. If the kingdom isn't the focus of our life, then we probably won't get there. And in a sense, I think that pulls together exactly what Jesus is trying to convey here in Matthew 13. It really does need to be the focus of our life. And obviously, each one of us will, scrutinise their lives, will begin to think about what direction they want to take with their life. Because ultimately, the choice comes down to, do you want to be in the kingdom or not? And that's really what I want to leave you with. Well, what's your ultimate goal in life? What is the goal that you've set yourself in this life? Is it a case that you want to be in the kingdom? Or is it a case that there is the deceitfulness of riches? And there are plenty of riches that are available in this current world. But never forget what Jesus described them as. It was deceitful riches. Choice is yours. Key question to answer. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Kent. I was thinking, as I just cast my eye down at the bottom of Matthew 13, as Jesus taught mainly in Jerusalem and Galilee, which university he went to come up with such an amazing education that he could so succinctly tell these amazing stories. And it says in verse 55 that he was a tradie. He was the carpenter's son. And they were all absolutely astonished at what he had to say. It takes a long time to write a short letter. So thanks very much, Kent, for tonight. And next week, God willing, at 2:30, we'll have the second instalment of Jesus' parables. So Kat's bought some snacks. Just remain where you are. We'll say thanks for that, and we'll enjoy that together. Loving Father in heaven, we're grateful for this little quiet time where we can meet together and more deeply appreciate the amazing capacity of your Son to teach. He looked at everyday life, the things that people did and were easily observable, and was able to make these amazing lessons, all designed to bring people's hearts and minds towards a kingdom which is described as a kingdom of peace and of justice and of fairness. And it's only right that your Son is the Prince of Peace. And he will be, even though the world is so violent and the antithesis of peace. We have an amazing hope which you've given us, and for that we're grateful. Thank you for all that we enjoy, for the clothes that we wear, for the shelter we enjoy, and also for good food. All good gifts come from you, and for that too we're deeply grateful. Be with us all this week. We ask for your blessing, dear God, that in health and safety we might remain until either we meet again or your Son returns to this earth and establishes your kingdom. We pray that we might return to you either 100-fold or 60-fold or 30-fold, and you will be pleased with us. In Jesus Christ's name, amen.